Okay, so we'll soon run this through the debugger, but first of all, we need to head back to our user store so that we actually do something other than log the response into the console. So after we have the response back from the Facebook login, what we'll do is we'll say agent.accounts.fblogin, and we'll say response.authResponse.accessToken. And then what we'll do is take our user object, or whatever we get back from the server just now, and we'll just console.log the response. And the Facebook SDK doesn't like async await methods, by the way, so we're back to promise len chains inside any Facebook methods we're using. So what we'll do, we'll just go back to our account controller, and rather than adding a breakpoint here, let's add it right at the top of this method, and we'll step through and see what's happening at each stage. So we'll head over to the debugger, and we'll use .NET Core attach, and we'll just hit the play button, and this should give us a list of processes to select from. It's easy to find on a Mac. We've got a .NET and API DLL. This is the one that I want to select. If you're on Windows, it may be slightly harder to find, so do look for API.dll or .api.exe, which is what you'll need to use on Windows, as it's presented slightly differently from what I see here. So I'm going to select the API DLL to start the debugger, and what we should be able to do now is head across to our browser. Let's just refresh this page and click on Login with Facebook, and we get taken to the debugger. So what are we interested in here? Well, first of all, we want to make sure we've got our access token, and we can see that there. And if we step over, we're then going to go and verify our token with our access token and our API keys. And let's just step over this one. And then we get to see the response. And if we take a look at the response inside here, then we can see that this is an OK response, and its success status code is set to true. So we're going to move over this one, and then we get, or we build our FB URL, including the access token and the fields that we're interested in. And then we'll go and make this request, and if we step over this, then we take a look at the response, then, well, this is going to fail. It says status code 400, and if I hover over this error, then we can see the problem of the reason for the bad request. And about halfway down it says tried accessing non-existing field picture on node type user. So I've got a typo basically in my controller. So I'm just going to disconnect the debugger, and yep, sure enough, it's correct. Picker doesn't exist. It's got to be picture, and that will more than likely work. So I'm just going to restart the debugger, pick the API DLL again. Now I've made that small change, and we'll try again. So I'll just go back to the browser. Let's just refresh the page first. Click on Login with Facebook. It retains the previous user that I initially said OK to. So that's the reason we don't need to do anything. We can just click it. And we know the first part works, so I'm OK with that. And then we'll take a look at our response. And this time the response is not there yet, so let's just step over. And this time the response is a success status code. So now we're going to move on, and we're going to get our content from the response. So I'll just step over this, and if we take a look at the content, well, we can see that this is a jumble of information that's kind of coming back in JSON format. Now the reason we're using a dynamic object is so that we can take those properties without actually strongly typing them, but because it's a dynamic object, then at runtime it's going to work out that there's a name property that's set to Barbara Test, there's an email property set to something else, etc. And if we step over Facebook info, then what we'll do is we'll take a look at what we're actually going to have to work with. So I'll just widen the screen here and get as much space as possible. So if we go into the FB info object, then we can go into the dynamic view, and if we expand this, then we can see the properties that we have access to: the email, the ID, the name, and the picture. Now the email, ID, and name are all values, and our picture is an object. So if we go further in, and we'll need to expand the dynamic view once again, Then inside the data object, and once again expand the dynamic view, then we can see that we've got something that we can use, this URL. So like I say, we could create a class that matches the properties that we're interested in getting back, but I did want to show you a different way of doing this. And now that we know that we're getting those properties, what we can do is we can complete the rest of what we're doing here. So for the FB info, rather than storing content in a variable, what we can do is just cut this bit of information and just paste it where content was. So we just turn this into a single line, because the method in here is relatively long. And what we want to do is we want to get our username so that we can use it in an expression, and we'll need to store this in a variable, as Entity Framework doesn't like it when we have to cast something into something. Now we're going to store our username, or what we get from Facebook, we're going to use the ID we get from Facebook as their username. We're not going to use their display name or the name property, because that's going to be difficult to work with, and they can change that on Facebook and we'll get a different value at some future point. But the ID won't change. But what we need to do is cast any of these dynamic object values into what they actually are, because our compiler does not know what type they are at compile time. So what we'll do is we'll say fbinfo.id is our username, and then what we'll do is we'll say var user equals await, and we'll say user manager. And we're going to need to access the users because we need to include their photos if we want to get an image from our database. So what we'll do is we'll say users.include, and we'll say p goes to p.photos. And then we can say first or default async, and we'll say x goes to x.username. That's equal to the username that we just created in a variable. And if the user is not equal to null, then they've already registered with us and we can just return the user object. So we'll return create user object and pass in the user. And if the user is null, then we need to create a new user in our database. So we'll say user equals new app user. And what we'll do is we'll say display name equals, and we're going to need to cast each of these properties into strings here. So we'll say string and fbinfo.name. No type safety, no spelling checks, nothing like that, I'm afraid, when we're using a dynamic object. So do be careful. And we'll again say string in brackets, and we'll say fbinfo.email, and then we'll say username equals string, and we'll say fbinfo.id, all in lowercase as well, by the way, as well. C# is a case sensitive language, so we need to make sure we match exactly the properties that we looked at when we looked at this in the debugger. And then we'll also add whatever we get back from Facebook as the image to the user's photos collection. So what we'll do, we'll say our photos is a new list of type photo, and we'll bring in system collections generic, and then open curly brackets, and then we'll specify a new photo, again more curly brackets, and then we'll say the ID. And so we've got a way of identifying that this is not a Cloudinary photo. What we'll do, we'll just specify FB underscore, and then we can say plus, and then cast the username or the Facebook ID as a string, and then we'll say FB info.id, and then we'll specify the URL, and we'll say this is again a string, and we'll say fbinfo, and then we're going to say picture.data.url, and then we'll say isMain equals true, because they're registering to our application and this is going to be a new photo. So let's try and sort this out so it's easier to see what's happening. And we'll just end this line with a semicolon. So if we do not have a user, then we're going to create a new user object with all the properties that we get back from Facebook. Be super careful with spelling when we're using dynamic objects because there's no type safety, and you've seen how easy it was for me to make a spelling mistake inside here. So if you do get a problem, then your first troubleshooting step is to make sure that you've named these things exactly as you receive them from Facebook, because you will get an error if you've got that wrong. So when we have a new user, what we can do is save that user to our database. So what we'll do is we'll say var result equals, and we'll say await and user manager, and we'll say create async, and we'll pass in a user. And then we'll just say if results.succeeded with the not operator, then we're going to return a bad request. And we'll say problem creating user accounts. And if we succeed, then we're going to return the create user objects and pass in our user. So what we should be able to do now is go back to our application, and in our user store, what we're doing just now is we're just logging out our user object after we've successfully logged in. So let's go take a look, and let's just refresh the page once again. And we want to take a look at our console to see what we get back here. So I'm just going to click on Login with Facebook. And what we get back is our user object. We can see our display name, we've got our image, we've got our token, and this is our JWT, and we've got our username, which is what the Facebook ID is. So we can now log into our application with Facebook. So all we need to do next is tie up the loose ends, and we'll take a look at that next.